Hi, my name is Audrey, and I am a member of Wake Up.
And I'm Rachel, and I run the social media committee in Wake Up.
And this is the Wake Up podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the voting age.
Wake Up, Speak Up, podcast.
So personally, I really think that we should lower the voting age to 16, namely because I don't think there's that big of a difference in how informed a 16-year-old is versus how informed an 18-year-old is. And I also think that they should have a bigger role in shaping the future of their country because they're the ones who have to live in it.
That's a really good idea, but I also think it shouldn't be lowered for many reasons, but I do believe it should have a limit. I got most of my information from PBS.org, and it told me that the last presidential election, 129 million people voted out of a possible 241 million, and that was millennials. In the last several decades, only 56 to 60% turnout of millennials only showed up during the presidential races, but percentages go down during non-presidential years and primary races. And I feel like most of that is the pressure that older people put on the younger generations.
So part of my position on lowering the voting age is that it's not a new precedent to lower the voting age. It was already lowered once from 21 to 18 in 1971 by Amendment 26, and it was the work of young activists. And we're seeing something very similar to what those young activists saw when they got the vote lowered, namely the fact that the support for the movement is about the same as it was right before the 26th Amendment was passed, which was 17% of the general population. And I think that it's important to start voting as early as possible because the sooner someone votes for the first time, the more likely they are to continue voting. So what happens is as people get older, if they haven't voted yet, they are more and more likely as each year goes on to decide to never vote. And so even a lot of different students and people don't necessarily think that the voting age should be lowered. I think that it's important to keep in mind that this is the world that they are going to be living in.
So, also on PBS, I learned that most of the restricted voting laws in most states discourage voter participation. So most states have a bunch of gerrymandered districts, and they cut across party lines, which obviously would reduce the number of the competitive racing, yes, and interests. So people just choose not to participate, and that's mostly due to older generations in politics, cutting across those lines to restrict younger voters. So I'm pretty sure if we lower the voting age, that'll happen even more. Because,
So you think that part of the issue is dealing with older generations repressing younger generations? The only way to get that younger voice would be to
have an age limit. Right. So I don't disagree with lowering the voting age. I just think that there's something else we should do first before we do that. Because if we just lower the voting age, then so many people will be restricted anyway. And it's already so hard to get registered to vote for so many people that if you lower the voting age, there's just going to be more restrictions.
I do want to ask, my position is that I mentioned that you are more likely to start voting sooner if you just start voting sooner. As you get older, you're more likely to vote. You're less likely to vote for the first time. You're more likely to not vote if you haven't voted yet. And so the reason I think that 16-year-olds, they're still living at home, they can get help from parents who are hopefully registered to vote. And a lot of 16-year-olds still pay taxes. They have jobs.
Yeah.
That's something that an entire war was fought over. It was taxation without representation. So that's where I'm coming from, and I also think that we should let everyone who's qualified to have voting rights have them, just because, no matter how old someone is, they're probably still paying taxes.
That makes a lot of sense.
So what is your specific age limit on voting?
I was thinking more of the silent generation and baby boomers. They're like ages 71 and older. And you were saying that, you should have representation in, even if like you're not educated and your views still matter, and you were saying that younger generations also aren't very educated, but I was thinking that, younger generations have time to change their mind, and they're willing to change their minds, but older generations don't really seem to want to do that.
So I had the age minimum in mind of 16 for voting, and I was wondering what your age maximum is for voting.
I would say ages 70 and older. From like one of the sources I have, it said that those ages made up 75 and 13% of voters.
I will agree that I think it's not necessarily fair that an older generation is that much of the voting population, but I do think that a better way to deal with it is to allow younger people to vote, even because there's an argument against teenagers voting, saying that their brains aren't properly developed to make important decisions, but at the same time, the real time that the brain stops developing is at age 25, and we allow 18-year-olds to vote, and we allow 21-year-olds to drink and smoke. So I really don't think that that's a valid argument in this case, and I think it's more important to think about the fact that teens are still spending a lot of time in the classroom being educated on the state of country, and not just the modern age, but also the past, because teens are way more likely to be able to spout off specifics about the way the government works than adults who've been voting for years.
I remember a conversation I had with my parents. They were like, we've been voting for years, we know what we're doing, but they just weren't educated on like the different politicians and their topics. Like that, I feel like that's a problem with many adults rather than teenagers. They vote Democrat or Republican just like for that name. They don't like go into what their policies are. They just vote.
That's kind of what this whole podcast is about. It's about focusing more on the small things and the topics as opposed to a platform or party, which is why we are just discussing voting age and voting rights without discussing party affiliations. Because there's also this idea that, and kind of based off that, this idea that like teenagers are focused on superficial things, which is really a stereotype. It's really harmful because sure, there might be like frivolous things that a teenager focuses on, but there's also really important things. Some of the recent activism we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement has been largely driven by young people, by some people who do have the right to vote, but there are a lot of kids that are in high school that I know were organizing protests. Here in Columbia, we had a protest that was organized in almost, I think, half in part by some students from Battle. And so it was just a really important movement and a moment in history, and it was just interesting to think about the fact that so many of those people out there were taking time and taking precautions in the midst of a pandemic to have their voices heard, that they can't have their voices heard in a voting booth.
I will say that for this election, I saw like many like younger kids on TikTok saying that they wish they could vote because like this is such an important election, and that like I know Biden already won and everything, but it was just way too close.
That's the same sort of issue I had. I was just shy of being able to vote, and I was very upset about this because I've been politically active for many years, and it's part of where my idea about wanting to talk about lowering the voting age came from, because both my parents are able to vote, and a lot of other members of my family are able to vote. My extended family and I can't vote. But I have had discussions with even adult family members about topics that they didn't know anything about.
Yeah.
And some of them are really obscure or dumb. I get that. But like even 16-year-olds, they have the time and the support to be able to learn about things in a way that some adults can't do because they're busy with things like working a full-time job, and it's a lot harder to keep up with the news when no one's actively reminding you of it. Whereas when you're in high school, we hear about it in the beginning of every class. When we have a big, and I'm sure Rachel could speak to this, when there's a big event going on, you hear about it, whether it's from teachers or other students. It is talked about in school, and it is discussed at
Every single day.
Yeah, and you hear a lot of different perspectives on it. And it really does come down to being up to you to find what you believe is true, find whatever facts and fact check things for yourself, which I feel like, to your point, I don't think adults do as much. As you get older, you fall into, on social media, on whatever you're using.
And you're very much like, I already know this because I lived through it, but
With the
you're not understanding what's going on right now.
And with the internet, we tend to get into media bubbles. And for teenagers, these bubbles are not so fully formed as they are with adults, because you spend more time on the internet. And so different news sources and friend circles, teenagers are way more likely to have friends,
information.
Friends and different opinions coming into their bubble, their media bubble, than adults are. And so I really think that teenagers hear more perspectives than adults do, and I think that it's important to keep that in mind when it comes to voting, because not only does the argument of saying that, oh, well, teenagers aren't well informed about issues, that's just not true. It might be true at one point, but now with the internet and with how much we talk about politics in class, it's just not true anymore.
And like, if you have those resources available to like learn these things and you like just choose not to, that's like unacceptable now. But I do agree that, you know, the younger generations have more knowledge, and I agree that, you know, they are a part of the population, so why are they not being represented in voting? It just doesn't really make sense.
I wanted to go a little more in depth about the reason why I think voting age should be lowered to 16 specifically. So when it was originally lowered in the 70s to allow 18-year-olds to vote, the rationale behind it was that 18-year-olds were able to enlist, but they were not able to vote. They were able to fight and die for the country, but they could not vote to make change happen in that country. I do agree with that statement, but I do think it's also important to think about, so 16-year-olds can enlist. However, what they can do, I mentioned this earlier, is pay taxes. And I think that it's important to think about the ways that the country's changed. And while, yes, 16-year-olds tend to typically still be a little more dependent on parents than 18-year-olds, a lot of 18-year-olds are still very dependent on their parents. And whether that's by, you know, parents helping them go to college, or they're still living at home while they're at college, it's very common. And while there was one point in history where 18-year-olds sometimes like moved out on their own right away, with today's current economic outlook, that's just not realistic. And so I think that this argument that, well, teenagers are more likely to be influenced by their parents' decisions, I don't think that's true. I think that there's a lot more drive in teenagers to make their own opinions than to just sit back and listen to what their parents are saying, especially when, like we were talking about earlier, you hear so many different opinions at school, and you are given the opportunity. We have all these tools at our fingertips to fact check and do our own research and understand how we feel about different topics. And so I just think that there's no good reason that a 16-year-old should be considered that different from an 18-year-old when it comes to voting. Their brains are only slightly different in terms of maturation and in terms of how informed they are, how independent they are. There's just not that big of a difference anymore.
And we're all just like still trying to figure out our identities and what we believe in. So
I think this is they're 18 now, aren't you? I'm not 18. Like I said, I'm a little bit shy of the election cutoff. And so, because we are recording this in mid-November.
So I also believe that when younger voters do show up and vote, they're drowned out by older voters. And that might just come down to the age of the country's democracy. Like, because of like the voter turnout and like there's no age limit on voting, new voters aren't able to change policies. And like I know so many people like don't want to change the policies because it's written right there. Like that's what America should be.
them.
Yeah, like that's what the founding fathers wanted because it's written down. But times change. Like we're not like if we have let's say we have like a newer phone coming out. You don't want to keep using a landline if it's not going to benefit you. So like why would you do the same thing with policies on literally what you're living off of in your freedoms? Like you want to change that to where it fits for you now, and you want to make a better future for your kids. Like you don't want them to go through the same troubles you went through. Like that's literally what I hear older people talking about all the time.
With
Like
that, if I did it, you have to as well.
yeah, like that's not it. That's not how it's supposed to be. Like you talk about all your troubles and your problems and all the challenges you went through when you were younger. Why would you want that for your kids? Like why would you want them to go through the same thing? So it doesn't really make sense to me. But you wouldn't want to change your policies. And like
I do get where you're coming from, talking about how difficult it is for a younger generation to effectively make change when an older generation is still voting. But I do think that just in general, I think before not allowing older people to vote, I think the better thing to do would be investing time and money into groups that help get people excited to vote and get people registered to vote, because there are real issues with just the difficulty of getting registered to vote, but also just transportation and all those things that make it so that people in lower socioeconomic classes having a more difficult time voting, and they become underrepresented. So I feel like a better way to address those sort of issues would be to address the issues that lead to those people having a lower voter turnout, as opposed to lowering a different group's voter turnout.
Okay. Everyone knows that like the country was built to benefit white men. Like that's a given. Nothing against white men, y'all are great, but like we need more representation. There's so many different types of people in the United States. Like we cannot just keep benefiting this one group because there's so many other people that need their voices to be heard. And I don't know how like other people's voter registration went. I know that mine was kind of I registered to vote online, and I didn't get my confirmation that I was registered until a few days before the election. And I don't know how easy it is for other minorities, such as Black youths or anyone else to register. I don't know how hard it is for them, because I know that if you're not white in America, it's very hard for you to do literally anything.
So I do want to know, if you don't want the age of maybe 70, people over the age of 70 voting, who is going to protect their rights? Because there's a real issue with mistreatment in nursing homes, and also just mistreatment of the elderly in general, along with issues with guardianship cases where, people have lost all of their money just because someone else thought that they couldn't handle it.
I honestly think that just comes down to the younger generation as well. So many parents are like, who's going to take care of me when I'm really old and in a nursing home? And it's like, well, we have to. You're our parents.
So you're saying put your faith in that younger generation.
Yeah, we're not just gonna let you down. We're not gonna do that. That's not what we're about. At least that's not what I'm about.
So I get where you're coming from with that's not what you're about, but I do think that it's perfectly normal to want to look after your own self-interest.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of why I don't think my personal belief is that having as many people voting as possible is the best way to get a picture of the democracy, and I think that does include older voters, even though I personally don't agree with a lot of them, but it's still their right to vote. They still live in the country, they pay taxes. I think that they should still be able to vote.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I feel like so many people just separate politics from their own, like their actual lives. Like they like act like one like type of person, and then when it comes to voting, they're like, oh, this is how it's supposed to be. So,
Yeah.
like that's just another issue that we need to talk about politics in our like normal lives because it's part of our normal
Yeah,
lives.
too many people try to separate politics and reality, and I think that's something we can both definitely agree on.
Wake up. Speak up. Podcast.